Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Shawit's Corner. I am your host, Shawit, and in this episode today, I wanted to talk about a something that I came across while I was reading a book recently, and something that the author said was that we have to learn how to endure our suffering. And I thought that was a really sort of enlightening way of learning how to deal with the suffering in our lives, because I think we have we're not necessarily clear on how to deal with our suffering in our lives. I think sometimes we think as Christians that once we become Christian that life is supposed to be a walk in the park, or it's supposed to be a breeze, and we're not supposed to experience any challenges as Christians. But I think there's always that temptation to understand Christianity in that way. But when you actually look at the lives of Christians who have lived in the past, rarely ever has it been a walk in the park or a breeze, so to speak. When you look at all the apostles, being martyred and whatnot, being crucified like our Lord. And even when you look at a lot of the saints as well, the saints never really lived lives that were easy. I think in the way hagiography is written and the way the lives of the saints are depicted, it can kind of come off as that maybe their lives weren't as challenging as it really was, because perhaps hagiography includes a lot of miracles that they performed and whatnot. Although the Synaxarium, does show that it'll tell their life stories and whatnot. But, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is we might have our own, uninformed way of thinking how the Christian life should look like. But when we look into history and we see the saints and the apostles and our Lord Jesus Christ himself, that oftentimes the Christian life is a life of suffering, as opposed to a life that doesn't include any suffering. But back to the point that I was making about that statement, that we have to learn how to endure our suffering. I guess the way that phrase is really or the way that sentence is made, it seems to imply a few things. I think the first thing that it implies is that that we are going to suffer whether we like it or not. So, for example, our lives will come to an end at one point, right? So it's not like our lives are not going to, that we're not going to experience suffering, in some way. But I really like that statement because it makes us understand that that life is not about running away from suffering, or, of course we do pray that that we're not led into temptation, but that we're delivered from the evil one, like in the Lord's Prayer. And it's obviously it's completely fine to pray for deliverance from temptation or challenges in our lives. God he doesn't delight in our temptation or our suffering. But the fact of the matter is that this world is a fallen world, and that there's a lot of corruption in the sense of that the world does not operate in the way that pleases God, or that God intended for the world to operate as He had created it. That there's crime and suffering, all these things are done to one another, and no one's exempt from causing no one's everyone has caused suffering in some sort of way to another person. I think we all know that, but I think the fact of the matter is that learning to endure suffering is probably a better way of looking at the situation, of looking at your own suffering, understanding that you have to endure it as opposed to wanting to get rid of it, because that is not always in our control. It's not always in our control to remove the suffering that is in our lives. Sometimes that suffering may be an illness, for example, or it may be another person. Whatever the case may be, if the suffering is caused by an external source, then it's not always feasible to to get rid of it. I mean, especially in cases where we're not able to get rid of that suffering. But to endure your suffering, that sort of that helps us realize that we have agency in these situations, and that we're not supposed to, passively suffer. We are to pray, and like the New Testament says, that we're supposed to, that even if we don't know how to pray, our sort of our yearning, or even like, I can't remember the word, it's like grunts or something, but our yearning to want to our yearning is brought up as a prayer to the Father, and that even when we don't have the correct words, when we don't know how to pray, that even our pain and our suffering itself, the intensity of our pain and suffering, that is brought up to God, and that is understood as a prayer as well. So, not having, the right words, to say is not necessarily the point. The point of prayer is supposed to be, from your heart and whatnot. You can say everything in the world, but if you don't really mean it, or if you don't understand it, that can be problematic. Or maybe not problematic. Problematic is not the right word, but for your own benefit, you have to learn how to pray with your heart, and not only to give lip service, so to speak. But so yeah, this idea of enduring your prayers, or enduring your suffering, or taking up your suffering, or carrying your cross. There's a lot of different ways we could express this idea, but I think it's really important because it helps us realize that's what gives us our agency, I guess, is this perspective. It's funny, I'm talking about perspective, and I'm talking about sort of, your circle of control or your circle of influence. I've been reading The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And that is one of those are two things that Stephen Covey, I believe is his last name, or Covey. But those are two things he talks about, how your perspective is very critical, for how you relate to things and whatnot. And that you have to really deal with your perspective. And that's how he kind of gets in the circle of influence, or your circle of control, those things that you have immediate control over. That's part of one of the ways that you're able to change your perspective. He's a perspective or paradigms. Those are, he uses those words interchangeably. But I think we have to be able to realize that that we can endure our suffering, and that we can carry our cross. If we talk about, if we use scriptural language to talk about carrying our cross, it's not necessarily an option. We're told to pick up our cross and to follow Christ. And so this whole notion that we're agents, I think that we have agency, free will. I think this is something that that confuses a lot of us, because our agency, just for the simple fact that it is something you have to sort of learn. It's like, I have agency, but then, God is another person, right? God the Father, or the Trinity, there are three persons, and I'm my own person, and we relate, to each other, in different ways. Or the Trinity relates to us, in different ways. And that, these are all things that you have to, it's understandable that it would be confusing. It's like, how am I a proactive agent when, at the same time I'm subordinate to Christ, or I'm, subject, or, is it subject, or, that the Lord is, that Jesus Christ is my Lord, So, that's, it's understandable that that's confusing. It's confused me for a long time, as well. And so reading this, this statement that we're supposed to endure our suffering, I guess it helped me realize that we're not supposed to run from our suffering, but we're supposed to bear our suffering, so to speak, and that our suffering can really, not that we should suffer, because that's not a Christian attitude to have. We don't go looking for suffering, but when we do suffer, that it can be redemptive, in the sense that it can bring us closer to God. As it always happens, suffering is really the time when we call to God with the most, prayers, with the most intensity and whatnot. So it can be a way for us to learn, that God is with us. Like the psalmist says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So even in the midst of, the darkest of times, the bleakest of times, we know that the Lord is still with us, that he is our shepherd, and that wherever we go, the Lord is there. Even though we may not see the Lord, with our physical eyes, the Lord is nonetheless with us. So again, the things that I had spoken about, just to reiterate what I said, was that enduring your suffering, learning how to endure your suffering, I think is the call for all Christians. And I think, all Christians do need to learn how to endure their suffering, because suffering is an objective fact of this world that we live in, this fallen world that we live in. So learning how to, so that means we can expect suffering at some point in our lives. Whether we suffer or not is not the question, but the degree of suffering we may experience may differ from person to person. But we should perhaps not be naive to think that we won't suffer, but we should believe that we have the strength in the Lord, to overcome our suffering and our challenges, and that this is ultimately a way to, to triumph over challenges in our lives. Suffering does not have the last word. Death does not have the last word. And this is our belief as Christians. So learning how to live a faithful Christian life, carrying our cross, is our calling. And so those were just some of the thoughts I had today from the book that I had read. I don't have the book with me, so I'm sorry I can't reference it. But I might put it in the description box below. But thank you everybody for tuning in. And until next time, I hope everyone stays well and have a good day. Bye.